Are going to actually go through the timing. Now, the it's nice to think this is a two-step process. The first thing we need to do is we need to actually set the points gap for the contactor. Now, the contactor is that device that is underneath the distributor cap that when the engine rotates, it opens and closes. And it is, in this case, we want it to, when it's about to slightly open, that's when it would spark. At least that's what I think it does. So, so we need to actually set the points gap first, or we need to at least confirm it. So the first thing I'm doing here is removing the spark plugs. So it's just easier to rotate. We're going to have to be rotating the engine by hand. So it's easier to rotate the engine when the spark plugs aren't in there so that we're not dealing with compression as when we're trying to get things over. So we're going to be rotating the engine quite a bit. And so think of this as a two-step process. First, we need to set the gap for the contactor. And the second is we need to make sure that it's going to spark at the appropriate time. Obviously, we want it to spark when it is at the top of its compression stroke, in essence. So here is the distributor, and I'm showing you a spark plug. And unfortunately, and I'm apologizing, the cameras that I used for this video are just absolutely awful. And this is supposed to be a 4K camera, and it's just not. And it is just awful. But when I'm cranking the engine, you cannot see it, but it's sparking. So, which is actually kind of always a good sign. So we have spark. So it's, at least we know that the coil is working. And generally things are working. We don't know if it's correct or not. So we are going to take the distributor cap off, and we are going to go through and set the points gap. So step one is setting the points gap. So in setting the points gap, we are going to kind of need to know what the what should the points gap be. So there are the Chilton's manual that I reference, and again, I'm probably going to put a link in this one. I'm going to put a link in the comments for this, but the Chilton's manual provides that the points gap should be 0.42 millimeters to 0.48 millimeters, or 0.016 inches, or 0.018 inches. And so the easiest way to figure out how to do the points gap is when you are rotating the engine, you want it so that when the points are as wide open as possible, that's when you measure. So the little tiny center thing, the cam, so it is like there is a little cam that rotates on the inside of where the contactor is. So as that is turning, one of the lobes is bigger, so it is going to open up the contacts as wide as possible. That's the point that you actually set the gap. So right here, you can actually see that there is kind of like a flat spot, or there appears to be a flat spot. And so when I rotate the engine, we're going to be able to see the contact points actually open up. And so the contact points are the two little metal discs in basically the 11 o'clock position. So when that little arm opens up, there are two little disc contact points that will open up. So I'm going to have to rotate the engine to actually get these to open. So here's the Chilton's manual. So for the breaker point gap adjustment, remove the distributor cap and rotor, then rotate the engine until the points are open as far as they will go. This is the point where the rubbing block is on the highest point of the breaker cam. Check the point gap with the 0.42 to 0.48 millimeter feeler gauge. So that is what we need to do. And then step number 3, where they say run a business card through the points to remove any deposits, that's really kind of universally done. So you'll take a business card. So the adjustment screw is that flat-headed screw right next to it. And so here with me with the screwdriver, I'm showing you where the highest lobe would be on that little camshaft. So we are going to rotate the engine. So I'm slightly rotating the engine. And we want to rotate it to where it is at its highest point. And you can just see it closing right there. So I'm going to keep rotating it. And it looks like it's opening up right now. So I'm putting the feeler gauge in, and so at this point, I just happen to know that the point gap is actually good. So it is, I don't have a 0.42 or a 0.48 feeler gauge. I think I had something in between. So I think I'm using like a 0.44 or 0.45. So it is, the feeler gauge is good. I mean, the gap is great. So if it were not great, I would be adjusting it with that flat-headed screw. I would slightly loosen it, and I would open and close the gap at that highest lobe, excuse me, at that highest point right there. And so that is where I would actually start off with. This is the first step. So we're going to set the points gap. So in this case, I'm not doing anything, and I'm double checking it and I'm triple checking it. I want it to be, well, I want it to be, it's got to be kind of at least in the ballpark too. Well, I don't want to say that, because these again, these engines are really robust. They run when things are crazy out of spec, but it's really close. So, and I am saying it's between 0.42 to 0.48. So again, I'm double checking, I'm triple checking, and it is, I'm feeling good about it. I'm wanting to, the way I'm checking it, I'm putting the feeler gauge in there, and I want it to basically rub against the contacts. I do not want it to push open either one. Well, I don't want it to push the spring loader open. So if I'm inserting it and it's moving the little contact point arm, that means it's actually too tiny. And if I'm putting it in there and it's not really scraping against both sides, then I don't like that either. Okay, so the next step for us is we need to set we need to make sure that it's going to spark at the correct time. So you see this little arrow on the front of the engine crankcase. That's like a little arrow that's for setting your timing marks. It's also for setting top dead center. And you're going to remember that I actually cut some slots in the back wheel, and just like a cheat sheet. So here's this first slot coming up. I actually cut that, and I used a protractor to cut that. That is top dead center of the right-hand cylinder. So that just makes life easy, and you should always do that. And the next 4 slots are basically for the left-hand cylinder. So the first 2 cuts that you see there those are for static, or I'm sorry, those are for dynamic timing. We're not going to do that. The fourth cut is for top dead center of the left cylinder. Now the third slot or the third cut is for static timing. So what we want to do is that is the point, and it's just before top dead center. So we want this to spark just a click before top dead center. So what we want is we want to rotate the engine, and we're going to be rotating the engine until we get to the compression stroke of the left-hand cylinder. So we're going to keep rotating it, and I'm going to do it a couple times. I'm going to do it probably 5 or 10 times just to make sure I'm comfortable that I'm on the compression stroke, so that when I'm on the compression stroke, that arrow lines up with the third cut right there. And I'm going to keep going until I'm comfortable I'm on the compression stroke. I'm using my thumb to just put it over it, because if you put your thumb over the spark plug hole, if you feel like it's compressing, then you're on the compression stroke. And so we already know where top dead center is just because it's the fourth mark here. So we just want to make sure we line it up on the third stroke. If you miss it and you go a little bit past, repeat it. Do not back up. So we need to line up on the third mark. And the next step is that we are now going to adjust the ignition timing. So I'm sorry for the camera here. This is an awful camera, but it's just by looking at it, I know that it is crazy off. And it is. So what you do here is you actually are going to move the distributor. So you're going to be rotating the distributor such that the contactor is just going to barely be opening on that. So it's hard to see, but I have fashioned a little light that's above the battery, and you see it popping on and off. As I'm rotating, what I've done is I've made a little continuity tester to where I have two wires going to this little light. One is connecting to ground, and one is connecting to where the condenser is connected. So I have little alligator clips. So it is one alligator clip, the positive is connecting to where the condenser is on the side of the distributor, and the second is connected to ground. As I rotate it, it is checking continuity. So when the contactors are closed, the light is on. When the contactors are open, the light is off. So that is how I am rotating it. So generally speaking, it is, in summary, what I'm doing here is I'm doing static timing on the left-hand cylinder. If the left-hand cylinder works, it's going to work on the right-hand cylinder. I removed the spark plugs. I rotated the engine until I got to the third mark. And once I got to the third mark on the compression stroke, I stopped. So again, the third mark is the static timing mark. And so that is where I stopped at. So right now I'm just rotating it because I'm just seeing where I am at right now. And it is, and I must say that it is, for this to work, you have to have the ignition switch on. So the bike's not running, but obviously the ignition switch is on because you need power going to, you need actually power going to the condenser. So it is, I'm good. There is a small little bolt that you're going to see shortly that holds the distributor in place. So if you loosen this little bolt, you'll be able to rotate the distributor. And we're going to rotate the distributor to the point where it is just barely opening to where that light goes off. That's where we want, that is where we want the timing. So So right here, you can see the distributor, and you see that little bolt that is underneath where the condenser, where the wire from the coil is connecting to the condenser. That is a bolt that we are going to slightly loosen, and that's how we're going to rotate the distributor. So obviously, we're going to be rotating the engine and get it to the point where it is going to be opening, because when it opens, that's when it throws the spark. And this is really where you can see how everything works. So I know they'd sell those continuity lights or test lights. It was just easier for me to make my own. So at this point, I'm rotating the engine and I'm getting it so that here I am loosening up the bolt because I need to adjust it. And again, I'm sorry for this camera. It's just awful. But I'm rotating the distributor because again, I want to get it to the point where it is barely opening when I am rotating the engine, and when it hits that third mark. So you can't see it in the background, but I have that test light. So as I'm loosening it, and there I'm clamping on my test light to the condenser. Well, to the stem that actually it's going, it's the wire coming from the coil that's connecting to the condenser. And these are just little test clips that I made. And it looks like it's really jammed up busy in there, which it kind of is. So it is, most of the time I really kind of have to reposition that clamp. So the clamp is there. And so I will be moving the test light in there so that you can see it opening and closing and the light going on and off. And at this point, I'm trying to get it to where the camera angle is good enough to actually see it. I used probably 5 or 6 different cameras, and I thought that these were great. This was a great camera I bought, but it was not a great camera. Okay, so there I have the test light in the view. And so this is where if I slightly rotate it, it turned off. And so you want to tighten it up so that right when it is on that third static mark, you can see the light. I mean, I moved the light, but the light is actually on there. But you want it to right where it is just barely off. And that's when you tighten it down. and that would be the static timing.